Now we're facing this mass move of school closures. It's happening very rapid. And our kids are feeling it. Our families are feeling it. And we have to continue to fight. We have to continue to ensure that our students, our parents, our community have the tools to be able to advocate for themselves.
Greetings. My name is Manuela Arciniegas, Executive Director of Communities for Just Schools Fund, and this is our podcast, Beyond the Bell, Organizing for Education Justice. Our podcast is committed to bringing you the voices, dreams, and brilliance of community organizers activating the public will for education justice. Together, we will learn how to support building a world where youth, caregivers, and educators are holistically safe, thriving, cared for, and invested in. We know our communities deserve to feel dignified and safe, irrespective of their race, economic status, zip code, gender, ability, or documentation status. Unfortunately, today's public schools in our communities are not yet these safe places to learn, grow, and live for the majority of Black and Brown, Indigenous, trans, queer, two-spirit, disabled, or undocumented youth and their families. Yet, organizers around the country are working hard to build these safe and supportive communities. And how do we get there? Today's conversation is filled with brilliant community organizers from across the CJSF Partner Network doing critical work around the country to ensure that youth are building safe and supportive schools and communities. We will dive deep into their hopes and dreams, their victories, and their collective wisdom, because organizers can teach all of us about how to build a world where young people are invested and resourced, not criminalized or punished. A little bit about today's episode. Today, you'll hear from two poderosas, awesome community organizers and educational leaders who are supporting young people, preventing school closures, getting cops out of schools, and advancing dignity that all communities deserve in Denver and around the country. Our first guest is Leidy Robledo. Leidy is the co-executive director of Alliance for Educational Justice Network. As a daughter of Mexican immigrants, by middle school, Leidy was already organizing walkouts to protest injustices in her school. And from there, she went on to serve as a youth organizer at Padres and Jóvenes Unidos, now known as Movimiento Poder. Leidy has led numerous campaigns from advocating for immigrant student rights to ending the school-to-prison pipeline and fighting for school budgets that are equitable. She was also involved in launching the Cops Out of Campus, one of the earliest efforts to remove police from schools, and she also helped establish a national campaign for police-free schools. Welcome, Leidy. Hola, ¿cómo estás?
Hi, hola, hola. Well, thank you for inviting me. So excited to be here.
We're so happy you're here, and I know you're joined by a super awesome organizer right next to you. Please welcome Elsa Bañuelos-Lindsay, a first-generation working-class Latina and daughter of immigrants. Elsa has dedicated over 22 years for fighting for equity and justice. Her journey began in high school, where she organized campaigns to improve conditions at West High School in Denver, Colorado. She is the executive director of Movimiento Poder, formerly known as Padres and Jóvenes Unidos, where she has done powerful work to build youth and community leadership. Elsa also empowered community members as a program coordinator for the Promotora project at Clínica Tepeyac. Welcome, Elsa. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having us here today.
We are so honored to have y'all here because I know y'all are always grinding, doing really powerful work out in the world, and your time is precious. And, we're going to kind of get to know you a little bit. Elsa, maybe we could start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about you and your background? What life experiences brought you to this work? And what's your vision for your community?
Thank you again for having me here today. I think it's just my life experience. I am first generation in this country. Both my parents were immigrantes, came from Jalisco, Mexico. And growing up in West Denver, working class, working poor, going through the education system that we're actually organizing in Denver. I've been in Denver public schools all my life, from kindergarten up to 12th grade. And just seeing the struggles that my mom, she ended up being single. So just seeing that struggle, seeing how we had access to limited, essential resources. I remember having to wake up at 5 in the morning for her to take us on the bus across town to leave us with the tia to take us to school. And then also just remembering how we had to rely on school meals and just, going through that. And also, having to go through our education system as a bilingual student. Spanish is my first language. I always remind people that, excuse my no sabo Spanish because I went through the system that really took away my language, part of my identity, and forgot that. And I had to reclaim that when I went to college and relearn how to read and write Spanish. So I think just my whole life experience has really allowed me to understand like there's a lot of injustices. And it wasn't until I got to high school where, again, same cycle, right? We had an amazing ally in our school who said, "This is not because of you." I was 16 and just going through those motions of like, I don't want to be Latina, I don't want to be Mexican, I don't want to be any of those identities and refused to speak Spanish. And once I realized that it was connected to racism, right? That there's a reason why that happens to many of us. I was like, I need to do something about it. And that's when I got involved in organizing at West High School, working on educational justice. And at that time, I also learned a lot about the Chicano movement that happened at West High School, like in 1969. And during that time, it was 99. It was my sophomore year. And I realized, like, wow, like history's repeating itself and I want to get involved. And that's just when I started to really just get involved in community work and haven't stopped since. And I feel that what keeps me going is just that leadership development, that spark, that hope that we have in our community. And my vision is to continue to doing the work. I've been very lucky and fortunate to have amazing organizers and mentors throughout my life. And I want to give back and continue that cycle and also develop amazing leaders, our team. I always love to uplift my team because without them, we wouldn't be where we are today as Movimiento Poder. And just continuing that cycle. And I know that, plantando our little semilla and continuing that because this is not going to end with me. It's not going to end with them. It's going to continue for many years to come.
I love that, Elsa, as you planting those seeds in the leaders, watching you reference that 30-year cycle of the first movements you learned about in 69, and then you jumping in 99, 30 years, and all this progress, and then pendulum swing back, right? So in those adverse cycles, we also hear the positive cycles that youth organizing helps bring new people to keep the fight and the change. I love that. And what about you, Leidy? Can you tell us a little bit about you and your background, your life experiences? What made you fight for education justice and immigration justice?
Yeah, thank you so much also for sharing so much of your story. I know sometimes life goes on so fast and we end up taking roles because we have to. Like I think for us mujeres in our history, right? Like we always step up to what needs to be done versus like this is what I dreamed of. So I think just thank you for sharing that piece of yourself. I think for me very similarly, I do come, my grandparents, both of them are farm workers. Both my mom's parents and my dad's parents were from Durango, Mexico. My grandfather is 91. He's one of the last ejidatarios in his region. One of these programs that were a result of the Mexican Revolution, right? Land reforms. So we always grew up knowing that we come from that movement. And my grandfather is still, makes sure that it reminds us every day. So it was really painful for my family to migrate to the US, right? Because they had farm land and they had animales, but because of the economic system, right, it wasn't enough. Like they couldn't afford to eat what they grew in their lands. And so that is what pushed them to come to the US, right? And so I think being very clear and then being very clear about understanding like why they were here. All of my family members swears that they're here temporarily and that they're gonna go back, right? And then years later, right, I have a whole family that's migrated out to the US. And so I think we grew up knowing that and having that very present and very rooted still to our Mexico culture. Growing up, my mother fought for bilingual education in our schools. And I think that really starts a lot of the spark, right? My mom actually going out there and demanding bilingual education. I went to a school that was one of the only, so I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona. We went to a school that was a Escuela de Bellas Artes, one of the only ones. And it was a school that was created because parents fought for it, right? Instead of art, we had cultural art class. Instead of just a regular band, we had a mariachi band. And so that was something that was fought for by community. And in 2005, right, when we see all these state bills in Arizona really trying to aim to make life really hard for immigrant families, one of the things that happened was they passed a bill that was English in the classroom. So they took away bilingual education. Me and my sister were the only ones that learned how to read and write correct Spanish, right? My little brothers weren't able, by the time they got to school, that school had to change their entire kind of method of learning because bilingual education was banned in Arizona. And so I think growing up in that fight was super important because it showed me that it was important for my family. And that's one of the reasons why my family came to the US, because they wanted to make sure we had a better education, not just for to have a better job, but it's like to be able to be connected to community. I think fast forward to like around the years 2008, my family was displaced from Arizona because of the housing crisis, and we moved to Colorado. And to me, that was a turning point in my political development because I had grown up under the Sheriff Joe Arpaio regime. So it was two reasons why we moved. One of them was the economic reason, but the other reason why was because things were getting hard for immigrants in Arizona. We were at a point where there was checkpoints happening in every, in a lot of the corners of the streets. I had family members that had been deported through raids at workplaces. And so we decided to move to Colorado, where it was a little bit different. But for me, experiencing the move was huge because I thought everybody lived in these conditions where there was checkpoints at every corner, where there were work rates in every corner. And so moving away from that made me realize that, oh, that's not the role of a sheriff, or like that there you could live a life where you're not having to watch your every move, because that's what we actually grew up under those conditions and during those years in Arizona. And so I think for me, what that created was I started questioning, okay, so why does that happen to our communities in Arizona? And seeing the other piece too is that we moved to a rural town in Colorado for a while. My parents had to go to start working in farmlands in Colorado. So I myself for a summer was working at an onion packing company in Colorado. And so then I started asking myself, why? Why does this happen to our communities? At the same time, I met this organization called Padres y Jóvenes Unidos out in Denver, now known as Movimiento Poder. And, a lot of the political education that they were doing was answering exactly that. Why does this happen in our communities? Why does this happen into our schools? And not just what are the root causes, but what are the things that could shift to make our quality of life better? And I think what was super valuable about why education, right? Because I'm coming from an immigrant background. The things that I'm experiencing is because of my connection to the immigrant community. But what was important was that Padres taught me that education is so important for our ability to practice self-governance and to have the community autonomy that we need in order to practice self-governance. If we don't learn how to think critically, how do we solve our own problems? And so unless we do that, we're going to be reliant on the people that are trying to control us. And I think that's where I understood, oh, we have to change education as a whole, because that's what makes a difference between our young people being controlled versus them being independent, being able to decide for themselves. And I think that's where I became a fighter for education, because I know that what we have right now is not getting us there. Not only do we have to fight for education, but we also have to transform the education system that exists so that it is pushing our communities, not just to get better jobs, not just for economic mobility, but it's like, how do we learn how to really solve the issues that impact our community? and become the people we want to become.
I love that, lady. Like your reflection, both of you, multiple times where forces pulled you and pushed you out of your home, out of Arizona, into other states, and facing the conditions and the overlap between immigration policy, policing systems, education, and seeing how all of those are connected. And your invitation, lady, into like, what does it mean to guarantee young people a right to learn and be a part of communities where they feel safe and they belong, and their curriculum reflects their history and actually serves their development and their agency, their self-determination and autonomy. And I know that a lot of these challenges are happening still today. And so, Elsa, can you tell us a little bit about what young people are facing in Denver today? And how is Movimiento Poder's work addressing that? What's the impact of the challenges that are coming from the way systems orient to our communities, the impacts on their mental health, their access, social services, like the whole shebang all the way around?
Yes. So it's still a lot of the similar conditions that I was in. Even though we've made some progress in current conditions are making it worse for a lot of our working class BIPOC queer community. What we're seeing a lot is just what we call like colonizing of our minds, right? Controlling us. And I really want to pause just to like address what Lady said. I think that that was also actually just very powerful. What you said is the piece that makes us, not just us as Movimiento Poder or AEJ and these organizations, what we're fighting for is being able to be treated as human beings, right? Being able to tap into our intellectual capacity that we are constantly told once we go into our schools that there's a plan for you. You are going to take orders. You are going to have these certain jobs. You are not meant to speak. You're not meant to think. And that is why, you know, a lot of us personally, educational justice is key for us because once we tap into that, once we tap into, yes, I can think for myself. And it has been set up for myself and for my family not to think and to really contribute to policies, to contribute to changes. But what's happening right now is there is a shift of really closing a lot of our public education schools, our public schools are the democracy of public education is dissolving as we speak. We've been fighting for many years to not only, you know, ensure the quality of education, ensuring that all our kids are prepared for college if they choose to do so. Now we're facing this mass move of school closures, and it's happening in Denver. It's happening very rapid. And our kids are feeling it, our families are feeling it, and we have to continue to fight. We have to continue to ensure that our students, our parents, our community have the tools to be able to advocate for themselves, to understand that what the district is telling us or making us believe that this is a new holistic approach, this is a community approach, is actually it's a move. It's a move for them to dismantle the little bit of hope that we have. We're starting to see now with a lot of cuts here in Denver, schools closing days before school started. And we're actually able to use that and say, look, this is why we don't need charters. This is why we don't need these types of schools because they can just close anytime. And this is why we need to ensure that we have these public institutions that are working for us, for our people, that are ensuring that we are ready for anything to come. So we're really working in alliance with AEJ and other organizations to ensure that we are keeping our district accountable, keeping Denver accountable, and really ensuring that there is a due process. One, we need to stop closing our neighborhood schools. It's a shame that our parents are having to figure out how to take their kids across town. It's a shame that our families are having to figure out, do I choose this school versus this school because it fits my schedule? I need a job. I need to be able to provide for my kid. So that's what we're working in a nutshell in terms of keeping that alive.
And just a quick follow up for you, Elsa. Like, I can only imagine how disruptive it is to find out 3, 4 days before school starts that suddenly your neighborhood school is not there anymore.
Hmm.
And parents have to scramble to figure out transportation and the whole shebang. I'm curious for you, like, as you've been organizing young people and families to speak up and speak out, I imagine you're engaging system leaders. How's it going? Like, how are they reacting to the demands of communities? What are you seeing, and where's their opportunity to really get them to show up and support what young people want and need?
It's been very difficult to get system leaders involved. I think that ever since we saw No Child Left Behind in the early 2000s, we saw this huge move, this huge shift of school choice, right? And it's been very difficult to even bring people that look like us, people who went through the same system. There's people that are my age that I went to school with that are now in these positions of power saying, no, we need to give school choice. And it's like, shame on you for saying that. Now you have the privilege to be able to afford that luxury of flexibility, time, and money. How about our own gente who don't have that? So we're constantly having to raise a ruckus. We have to continue to build that base and build that consciousness within our community to be able to build that power, to be able to hold them accountable and say, look, these are our schools. These are no longer your schools. And elected officials, you are there because of us. And also, we can vote you out, I know, but we had to constantly remind people. And we're learning as we go because with this whole new administration, things have gotten much more sharper. Who's with us and who's against us? It's not so much who's against us, it's more like who's not willing to take it up, to take a stance. And we're working very hard, double, triple time to really get them to say, you have to take a stance. You have to take a stance not only around education, but this is also taking a stance not only for young people, you're taking a stance for our immigrantes, you're taking a stance for our workers. It's all interconnected. And I would say that in the last few months, we have been making some shifts. It's going to take a little bit of more time to be able to say, look, now we have these people in power who could advocate internally, but it's the stakes are higher. And I think that our young people, our leaders are doing an amazing job of just not backing down. We had this, like, for example, we had our summer academy this summer and we showed them our student bill of rights and there's 10 points there. And we're like, clean slate, let's see of the 10 issues, what is the issue that still is close to you and it's impacting you, your friends, your family, your community. The two issues, immigration and school closures. So this is real for our people. And we have to continue to say, look, this is not just coming from the organization. This is not coming from people on staff. It's our young people. It's our parents. And it was a good reminder to say, you know what, we had a fight early in the fall, thanks to AJ and other allies and other partners across the country that really like supported us. We made a dent. We lost, but we built some power. We moved some people, and we're going to continue to do that. And we're going to continue to say, look, our students, this happened, but they're not backing down. They're not backing down. And if you don't, eventually, for those people who are worried about their vote later down the road, these students are going to be able to vote for you later. So you better do something about it. So we're being more aggressive because so much is on the line. Schools, like, just listening to Leidy and reflecting on my own personal story. For a lot of immigrantes, like, the school is a place, it's a natural hub. It's a place where you build new relationships. It's a place where you network, where you get information. And we have to continue to protect that. We have to ensure that that safety net is there, right? And not only are we pushing for stop closing our schools, but ensuring that we do have those wraparound services, that we do open up our schools for community so they feel safe, right? So that's not a place for ICE, that's not a place for police, but it's a place where we build community, we build the collective resources, and we take care of each other, we take care of our kids and our families. So we're ready for the challenge and we're ready to fight. We're ready to just move these people who say that they're with us. But at the end of the day, if you're not, we're also amping up our game because so much is on the line.
I hear that, Elsa. And it's hard because I think a lot of people have been, when you look at all the camps around who's pro privatization of public schools, right? You look at all the changes from the federal to the state level about where public funding could go, should go, stripping public funding for disability rights for young people, stripping it from any programs that are for targeted populations, even trying to push for the denial of public education for immigrant young people. How many families in our country have mixed status households where young people might have a documentation status, parents don't? It sounds like, a lot of people, they're trying to find their way. They're not being engaged. They don't understand how their elected officials and system leaders are making these moves. So it's really important that they have a Movimiento Poder and the young people have a space to come into knowledge about their political understanding of the world and see the forces that are driving the erosion of schools as a public good. Because in addition to the networks that you mentioned, it's also a place where people get their only hot meal. It's a place where I think some data came out where LGBTQ young people, if they had mental health needs and requests, schools was the only place where they could access support. And without schools having the funding for the counselors and other supports, where are they going to be connected, right? How else would they get the critical healthcare that they need? So this is like, there's a lot on the line for our young people in our communities. And, you talked a little bit about policing, because there's this narrative of the public government is not spending money well. And so we need to change the way we do it because education is misspending. We need to spend money on other things. But we're watching how much money is moving into ICE and immigration detention. And that's related to policing. So, Leidy, can you tell us a little bit about AEJ? What's the history of the Police Free Schools movement? And how do you connect that to all these other struggles around schools as a right, education as a public good and a right, and these other things that are public goods, the public safety net that Elsa's talking about?
I mean, I think for folks who aren't in the education justice fight, right? I think something that I like to share because it's hard for it to understand is like AJ was founded because we needed a national movement for education. And that was a hard thing to build because, unlike, for example, immigration, where you can just do a federal policy, education is super local. It's super local. Policies are, we're not talking about like state or county. We're talking about like sometimes it's like city level. Even within a city, you have multiple districts, right? Which is the case for Phoenix. We have like 13 districts out there. So the changes have to happen district by district. And then governing bodies are different for schools, right? Some schools are the best practice. What we like to see is school boards having control of what happens in schools, but some districts don't have a school boards, or the school boards are appointed by a mayor's governor. So it's really hard to do a national movement when we have different decision-making structures and policies at different levels that impact schools. And so AEJ began with a group of organizers that were having these fights at a super local level, right? And what we saw is that folks were fighting for the same things. They were demanding for the same things. We saw the same patterns in terms of attacks and the policies that were happening. We knew this was back in like 2008 when I joined some of these conversations. I was a youth leader. Most of our organizations were youth-led. Some were multi-generational. When we started having these conversations, we made sure youth leaders were part of the conversations. At that point, we knew that white students had become a minority in public schools, and we knew that that was one of the reasons why the general society was defunding schools. So we started seeing this. The excuse back then to defund schools was high-stakes standardized testing. But we knew that really behind this standardized testing was really just a tool to decide what schools were going to have to get less funding and what schools were going to start closing down, right? And so that was how the kind of the root of how AEJ began, having these conversations and understanding education as a system, not just as what your school district or what your state does, but then started seeing these national patterns and started seeing that there was a set of people, right, of really rich people that wanted to get their money from the public schools. And so we knew that these privatization movements were going to start. And so it did, right? And so unfortunately, under the Obama administration, right, we saw these reforms that were framed to be good for the community, but we knew that at the end, once these charter schools were going to come in, they were going to crack local public school districts to the point where they could no longer compete with these charter schools, and then they were going to start closing their own public schools. So it was almost like a cycle. Charter school comes in, gets the best students, then the public school is left having to spend more money on the students that they kept because of standardized testing, right? Like the charter school is taking all the best performing students, but the school district still had to provide all the services that the charter wasn't forced to provide, right? And so we saw this cycle of public schools needing to spend more money on their students and in test results seeming like they were underperforming. And so like there were all these loopholes, right, that made the public schools have to spend more money but get less money for them, until the point where then there were no community schools that you can go because they were all closed down. And so then students were having to be forced to go to these charter schools, and charter schools not having to take in students. Like they can decide who they take in, whereas a public school has to take in all the students. And so we start seeing this cracking of the public system, right? And I think like that's important to understand, because we can talk about school by school, which ones is a better option. But when we think of a whole, what a district provides, what a district is supposed to provide to community, it's not comparable, right? Or you can't compare one thing to another. And so when we started seeing this, it was like a disease coming in. You saw it East Coast going West Coast, right? To back in 2010, we were fighting school closures in Philly. And then you fast forward to 2024, here we are fighting the same exact thing in Denver, right? So we saw this as a pattern, and we've been trying to fight. Like it's been a long fight, right? Of slowly breaking the public system. And once you get to that point, it's really hard to get back to where schools were before. And we need to point out that we started seeing this as we knew that majority of students were students of color. The society made a decision that it was no longer in our interest to fund public schools when the majority of students were students of color. And so I think like that's something really important that we have to hold politicians accountable for, because that's the message that we did through our actions these last couple of years. And so I think as we're fighting the existence of our public schools, I think the other piece that was super important for us is understanding, we always say schools are microcosms of our society. And so everything that's out in our society, we see them reflected in our schools, right? And so as we saw high repression and control in our criminal justice system in general, we saw that in our schools as well. So we started tracking the school to prison pipeline, not because we were looking for it, but it was like the number one push out reason for our students. Our students were being pushed out through discipline policies. And we, as AJ, one of our first fights was to get the Department of Ed to just track the discipline policies, right? And how people are being pushed out. In the first year, it was, you could not make an excuse for it. You could see that Black students were more likely to be disciplined. And not only that, but also be referred to law enforcement. Year 2 comes in with the data. Like the pattern was, you couldn't fight it. You could not fight it. And so then the question had to be like, why is this happening to students, right? And at first we started changing contracts, MOUs. We started changing discipline code. But I think at the root cause, we realized that young people in our school systems, we feel that young people need to be controlled and need to be disciplined, versus seeing them as students who are out here learning, who are making mistakes, who need to learn a process of accountability, of being able to make the right choices. And so slowly we started going deeper into our understanding of the school to prison pipeline and understanding the impact of all these policies. And I think where we found the most harm was when we saw the impact of having school police in schools, right? Now we're not just talking about students being kicked out of schools, but we're actually tracking assaults that are happening by police officers to students in schools that nobody's talking about. That is data that's not being collected, that like we are the only ones that are tracking that information, right? And so all of those led us to start having policies around the amount of money we're spending on this policing system in schools, the alternatives that like what could we be paying for instead of police officers, and then actually talking about the root causes. Well, what are the reasons why their schools are saying we need police officers, and is that the real solution to the problems we're seeing in schools? And that led to the building up of the national campaign for police-free schools.
It's really powerful, lady. Like, just a reminder that we orient towards certain communities as bodies of control and punishment, that's all they're worthy of. And then we defund them, we divest in them, we criminalize them, we punish them. And then we make that the excuse for completely destroying the public education system. And your connection around the amount of resources that have gone into the school policing bodies and structures in public schools and in communities, right? And we see that as when you talked about the school to prison pipeline, now school to deportation pathway and pipeline as well. Can you talk a little bit about that toolkit that y'all work with in Advancement Project? You know, you all, when y'all started the Assault Act campaigns, it was to make visible the fact that we have made it commonplace to physically lay your hands on the bodies of young people in schools if you're a police officer. And that meant everything from sexual assault to corporal punishment to physical abuse. And that those are the institutional climates that we say our kids deserve. And now we're seeing the encroachment of ICE and immigration and criminalizing forces on local communities and even into the school buildings. And y'all stepped in with Advancement Project and others, a bunch of other national partners, local partners that CJSF also is in relationship with. What was the toolkit about, and what's been some of the work y'all been doing in the last 12 months to try to support communities to respond?
Yeah. One of our biggest fears right after November was that because we've been doing a lot of research, it's amazing the lack of accountability these law enforcement agencies have once they're in partnership with our schools. Like schools believe an MOU is going to protect them from like bad acting police officers, and it's not, right? Most people don't realize that when law enforcement are hired by your school, you're not under control of like what they do most of the time, unless your school district has its own department. Like there's very little accountability of what you can do. And we see this right through the assaults that have happened. Once a police officer is involved, principals, teachers really, they don't have command and control of these officers, right? And there's very little training on how to handle. Like, we assume that because there are resource officers, people assume there's special training that goes in them, but they really are regular, like they are police officers, right? And will act like police officers. And I think like that's something super important because as this new administration took over, we knew that the lines between ICE and police and just all the law enforcement agencies were going to become blurred. And that was one of our biggest concerns. Like now we really do need these police officers off campus because once a student is going to be in contact with law enforcement, if they are undocumented, even if they have DACA, even if it, unless they are US citizens, like they're going to be put in this pipeline, right? And it's really hard once they're in this deportation pipeline, it's really hard to get them out. We knew that those interventions that used to work were not going to work this administration. And so we felt it was super important to create a toolkit that would help students and schools try to create shields of protection for students. And so some of these defense do include, obviously the first step is like get rid of any law enforcement you have in your school because there's no control of it. And I think the other pieces that we try to provide tools for policies, practices for school districts to adopt. So if you don't have a policy in your school district, there's a toolkit that actually steps out, lays out steps by step, every step each staff person from the administrator to the janitor, right? To maintenance. What should you do if ICE shows up and tries to have contact with a student? And obviously, I think at this point, we did a really good job in making sure people know you do not share anything without a warrant, right?
Mhm.
Without a judicial warrant. But I think it's also around other pieces that people don't know about. Or it's around keeping police officers out of physical space, because once they're in contact with anyone, they can ask for documentation, even if that's not the person they're looking for. They have that right. So how do you keep law enforcement out of your campus as a whole? How do you create steps and use bureaucracy on your side to slow down any search of students that they might be doing? And not just students, but also parents, right? We were very clear that while immigration might not be looking for young people, they would use them to try to get parents, right? And we've seen the many tactics that have been employed by this administration. They're being sneaky. We already had moments where school districts had contact with some type of federal law enforcement agency, and we could see that the schools who had policies and practices in place, it had a very good result, right? And were able to protect students at the best of their capabilities. But there are steps that districts should be taking at this point, and everyone who's involved with the school should know what their protocol is in case there's law enforcement in their campus. We also have a few other tools that you can use. So like if your district's not there,
Yes.
if they're not ready to make those policies, like we have a few tools that help you do the political education, agitating the community to demand school districts to do it. Because at this point, we're as protected as your school administration is willing to put the line. So we do need them to step up. And there's some tools to help you organize your community if your district's not ready to pass those policies just yet.
That's great, Lady, because it sounds like really it's going to be up to all of us, the people, to make sure that we hold our school district leaders, our principals, our teachers, to call them in to be brave, because the protection of our young people's civil rights is on the chopping block. And we cannot allow for the increased distress that's coming because of these policies. You know, we've seen a spike in chronic absenteeism. Some data just came out around how many young people are just not going to school anymore in California and other places. We've also seen evidence of places like Chicago, like sanctuary cities, who said, no, not here. You're not allowed to take these harmful acts, and watching the punishment of public funding that goes against these cities or some of these municipalities because folks were brave. But that's the kind of courage that it's going to take, and the peer-to-peer support and training. And that's why what Movimiento Poder does and what AEJ does is so critical and important to resource, because it really is relationship building, political education, training, tools, supports. And that's what's going to really help us hold the line and protect young people. And so we're coming up close to time, you guys. I just wanted to know if you could share a little bit of advice for young people, advice for caregivers, for teachers, advice for system leaders, and even advice for philanthropy, because we all know that there's been some chilling effect, some risk aversion, some defunding of base building organizing groups, because people have been afraid, like you said earlier, Elsa, like they come from our communities, say they're with us. When push comes to shove, folks are not showing up and taking the brave actions that we're going to need. So feel free to pick any one of those stakeholders I mentioned. What advice do you have for that group? And what's your call to action? So I'll start with you, Elsa. What advice might you have?
I think right now for young people and parents is just take care of yourself. This is an emotional time for many of us, many for our people. So it's okay to one day be sad, frustrated, angry, but just don't lose sight of the end goal being that we need to continue to fight and we need to continue to raise our voices, because that's what they want. People in power right now want us to be quiet, want us to be scared. And that is why we have to continue to step up. And that is why we need policymakers, philanthropy, to continue to provide resources and support for us to continue to do that. Allow us to have that space to be able to grieve, to be angry, but then we also need organizations to be able to process, to help our people process that anger, that frustration, that fear to something that will result in long lasting change for our communities.
Thank you, Elsa. And where can people go if they want to fund or donate to Movimiento Poder to be a part of the beautiful work y'all are doing to train and prepare young people for what this season of organizing is asking us for?
Yes, so we're very active on social media, Instagram and Facebook. Just search for Movimiento Poder or our website, movimientopoder.org. And you can definitely just connect with us there.
Fantastic. And Leidy, what about you? You have all this brilliant, you've been organizing for more than half your life, sis.
I know.
And Leidy's one of my organizing movement elders, right? What's your advice, having seen all of these seasons, even leaning into the legacy of your abuelito and that land movement from Mexico and the education, the community governance of local education in Mexico, that legacy that you come from? What's your advice for this moment?
I would say I want to give two. I want to give one for start with philanthropy. Don't give up on education, right? I think Frederick Douglass said, it's easier to build strong children than repair a broken man. And I think like that's an important quote for us to think about. Like, it's easier to invest now for the future leaders that will make this world a better place. And education is a microcosm of society, and we've seen it, right? When we want historic changes for the better, it starts in education. When we see it work, then it also transfers to society. You know, segregation ended in schools, right? It wasn't until we were able to get it in schools that it translated to all mainstream society. And I think like we have to keep investing in schools, because if we give up there, we give up as society as a whole.
That's
and
right.
I think very similarly to the people, right? And I think it doesn't, I'm not talking about the physical building of a school, right? The community, like we need to continue this practice of educating our youth and let's not abandon our young people. If you go on TikTok, there's so much wisdom from young people. They know what's up.
Yes.
Let's listen to them and let's listen to their needs and continue to build this community of care and nurturing for them.
Right on. And is there anything you want to say to your fellow organizers out in the world doing this really beautiful, brave, hard work?
Yeah. You know, we're living in hard moments and we will survive this. We will survive this. And the work that they do is so amazing. And surviving one day, surviving one fight is all it takes for us to keep moving forward. And so, similar to what Elsa said, making sure that all of our organizers are taking care of themselves, because this is not a sprint. This is a long fight. And we want you all with us for the years to come.
Thank you, Leidy, Elsa. Shout out to Movimiento Poder and Alliance for Educational Justice, who've been doing this work, y'all, for a long time and need your support and your camaraderie and your solidarity more than ever, because they really are setting the leaders of tomorrow and the leaders of today. In every major social movement, it has been young people who have set the bar and have always challenged us to dream better and do more. And so thank you both for joining us. And we'll see you out in the organizing streets and in all the powerful spaces where we're being invited to and have to show up for young people. So thank you both.
Thank you, Manuela.
That was Leidy Robledo from Alliance for Educational Justice and Elsa Bañuelos, former executive director of Movimiento Poder. When we last heard from Leidy and Elsa in August 2025, they were building on years of developing immigrant youth organizers to address school closures in Denver, Colorado. After some time, they made an assessment that connecting the fights for police-free schools, ending school privatization in immigrant communities, all of this was part of the plan to erode the civil right to a free public education and the human rights of undocumented youth in their communities. Earlier last year, they made the decision that the next best step was to prepare youth and families for the increased attacks on their civil liberties. They soberly anticipated what was coming and realized mass civil disobedience would be required. Since then, their warnings have become reality. Across the country, and most visibly in Minnesota, schools and communities have faced an unprecedented escalation of federal immigration enforcement. At Roosevelt High School in Minneapolis, federal agents clashed with students and community members and deployed pepper spray on school grounds, triggering school closures and widespread fear among families and educators. Teachers suddenly found themselves in an impossible position to not only teach, but to provide increased care while serving as the physical protectors of young people, protecting them from violence at the hands of ICE. And they met that call with courage, love, and conviction. Back in August, Leidy told us something that feels even more urgent today. We must invest in youth organizers. We need their courage to lead direct actions. We need their analysis. We need their ability to build relationships across communities and movements. What's heartbreaking is that this moment is asking immense courage, not just from educators, but also from young people, many under the age of 18. Although necessary to sustain and build community power, we recognize it comes at a risk to their safety. Yet, youth are making their own choices, making the assessment that these mobilizations and courageous actions are necessary to protect themselves and their communities long term. The truth is, the work isn't slowing down. If anything, it's accelerating. The Alliance for Educational Justice's network, more than 20 organizations across 10 states, is building the community infrastructure we need right now. They're supporting mutual aid, training young people, organizing educators and immigrant families, and labor unions to reimagine what safety should look like in our schools and communities. Please support their incredible work. Donate abundantly to meet organizers at the scale of the courage they need to deploy to face these unprecedented attacks. You can donate to Movimiento Poder at movimientopoder.org. That's movimientopoder.org. And support Alliance for Educational Justice Network through advancementproject.org. Because the future of our communities will be determined by the young people who are organizing today and by the allies, people like us who choose to stand with them. Thank you for listening. Our podcast was brought to you by our producer, Phil Circus, and by Communities for Just Schools Fund's Funder and Organizing Network, made up of 65 grassroots organizing groups and 20 plus foundation donor members. Please subscribe, like, and share. Stay strong.